Imagine heavy velvet curtains muffling the sounds of the outside world and the twilight of a royal bedchamber, lit only by the flickering candles made of expensive beeswax. In the air hangs a complex bouquet of scents: lavender, with which the linen is impregnated, musk, emanating from heated bodies, and the inevitable earthy notes of human physiology. In the center of this scene is a monarch, ruler of a vast empire, a man whose word can send armadas of ships to the ends of the earth or take the life of any subject. But at this moment, he is absolutely defenseless. He sits on a velvet-upholstered wooden box with a hole on top, his doublet unbuttoned, his gaze fixed on emptiness or on the person standing nearby. This second person does not look away. He is not a servant in the usual sense. He does not tremble with fear or try to disappear. On the contrary, he is calm, focused, and holds a linen cloth or a bunch of soft wool in his hands. This is the groom of the stool. At this moment, when the king is most vulnerable, when the mask of majesty falls away and only mortal flesh remains, it is this man who possesses power that prime ministers and generals would envy. Here, in the silence of the privy, the fates of nations are decided, secrets are whispered, and alliances are forged that historians will speculate about for centuries. To understand the phenomenon of this position, we must discard modern notions of privacy and hygiene, which have only developed over the last century and a half. For a 21st century person, the idea of a stranger, even the closest friend, being present during natural necessities seems wild, awkward, and humiliating. However, the mentality of a person in the Tudor or Stuart era worked completely differently. The king was not just a man. In the minds of people of that time, there was a concept of two bodies of the king: the physical body, which ages, gets sick, and requires care, and the political body, a sacred, immortal symbol of the state bestowed by God. Any contact with the monarch's body, even in its most base manifestations, was considered not dirty work, but an act of service to a higher power. To cleanse the king, to help him with intimate hygiene, to see his nakedness, meant to be admitted to the Holy of Holies. This was a privilege for which the noblest families of England fought, intriguing and undermining each other for the chance to hand the monarch a towel. This position, officially called, quote, zero in English, appeared in the early Tudor era, although its roots go back to the deep Middle Ages. The word, quote, one here referred not to the process, but to a piece of furniture, a portable toilet, often a work of art, upholstered in expensive velvet, decorated with gold nails, and fitted with a soft seat, inside which was hidden a pewter or copper pot. This object was the center of the groom's universe, but his duties extended far beyond simple hygienic assistance. This man effectively became the king's shadow. He woke up before the monarch, checking the readiness of clothes and the cleanliness of the room. He slept at the foot of the royal bed or in an adjacent room, ready at the first call to come to help, be it a nightmare or thirst. But the main asset of the groom was time. In the monarch's day, scheduled down to the minute between council meetings, reception of ambassadors, hunting, and feasts, the time alone in the privy was the only moment of silence. And it was in these minutes, when the king was relaxed and physiologically satisfied, that the groom could speak. Imagine the level of trust required for such a role. The king had to be certain that the person behind him would not exploit his helplessness, poison his washing water, or tell enemies about his digestive problems, which at the time were considered state secrets, as the monarch's health directly impacted the dynasty's stability. The groom of the stool knew everything about the king: his diet, his hidden illnesses, his mood, his fears. He saw the bruises on the royal body, knew with whom the monarch had spent the night, and often it was he who delivered notes to royal favorites or secret messages to political allies. In fact, this person controlled access to the king's _quote_0_, both literally and figuratively. If the chancellor had to wait weeks for an official audience, the groom had a guaranteed half-hour with the king every morning and every evening. This created a paradoxical situation. The person formally responsible for waste disposal became the cleanest and most influential channel of political communication. The outer layer of this phenomenon was brilliant and enviable. The groom of the stool received enormous privileges. He was entitled to full sustenance, luxurious chambers in the palace, the right to wear the king's old clothes, which in itself was a sign of incredible favor and a source of wealth, as royal garments cost fortunes. But most importantly, he managed the so-called privy purse. These were the monarch's personal funds, not accountable to the treasury. From this purse, gambling debts were paid, gifts to mistresses, bribes to spies, and the ruler's personal whims. He who holds the purse strings also holds the reins of the court's shadowy side. Grooms quickly grew rich, acquiring lands and titles. Their antechambers were crowded with petitioners, hoping that during the morning toilette, their petition would be, as if by chance, mentioned to the king. This caused fierce hatred among the old aristocracy and official ministers. Imagine the irritation of a Lord Chancellor who had prepared a complex state treaty only to have it rejected because in the morning the groom whispered a joke or gossip to the king that cast the Chancellor in a bad light. However, beneath this facade of power lay a deep internal conflict. What was it like to be an aristocrat, the son of a proud lineage, and spend one's life examining the contents of a chamber pot? Despite the sacralization of the royal person, physiology remained physiology. The smell was real, and no amount of incense could completely mask it. The groom had to possess a steel stomach and an absolute lack of squeamishness. Moreover, he was required to have medical knowledge. In those times, diagnosis was based on the theory of humors, and the analysis of excrement was a key method of assessing health. The groom was obligated to carefully inspect what the monarch expelled and report any changes in color, consistency, or smell to the royal physicians. It was a dirty, unpleasant job that could not be delegated to a lower-ranking servant, as that would violate the protocol of secrecy. Every day, this person balanced between the role of a great dignitary and the role of a sanitation worker. This dualism broke many, but others it hardened, turning them into cynical and calculating players. Internal tension was amplified by constant fear. Proximity to the king was not only a gift, but also a curse. The closer you are to the sun, the faster you burn. Kings, especially those as suspicious and volatile as Henry VIII, often turned favor into wrath. The groom of the stool knew too much. He was the keeper of the darkest secrets, and in moments of paranoia, the monarch might decide that such a witness had become too dangerous. History knows examples where people in this position ended their days on the scaffold, precisely because their intimate closeness to the ruler began to burden the ruler himself. Friendship with the king is always playing with fire, where your head is at stake. The groom of the stool had to be not only a servant and advisor, but also a subtle psychologist, sensing the slightest fluctuations in his master's mood, able to become invisible at the right moment and indispensable at another. On a philosophical level, The existence of such a position raises profound questions about the nature of power and human dignity. The entire system of absolutism was built on the idea that the king is God's vicar on earth. But how to reconcile divinity with the need to go to the toilet? The groom of the stool was the link that connected the celestial and the earthly. Through his service, he seemed to say, yes, the king has human needs, but even they are sacred. It was a ritual of grounding power, which paradoxically elevated it. If the most powerful people in the country are willing to fight for the right to wipe the monarch's backside, then this monarch truly possesses a supernatural aura. It was a form of social contract. The aristocracy recognized the absolute power of the king through its humiliation, which was transformed into honor. In the modern world, where leaders strive to show their closeness to the people, their quote one, this concept seems alien. We want to see people in politicians, but at the same time we despise their weaknesses. In the past, the king's weaknesses were part of his strength, because they were served by the elite. This position acquired particular development and drama during the reign of Henry VIII. This king, known for his suspicion and cruelty, turned his private chambers into a real control center for the country. The official Privy Council often remained ignorant of the king's true plans, while the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, led by the groom of the stool, knew everything. The most striking example of this era was the fate of Henry Norris. He was an exemplary groom of the stool, charming, discreet, endlessly devoted. Norris was not just a servant, he was the king's closest friend. They hunted together, played cards, discussed women. Norris controlled access to the king so tightly that even the highest dignitaries had to fawn over him. It seemed his position was unshakable. But it was precisely this closeness that led to his demise. When Henry decided to get rid of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, he needed to accuse her of treason. And who could be a more plausible lover of the queen than the person closest to the king, having access to all corners of the palace? Norris's tragedy is a turning point in understanding the danger of this position. He was accused of using his position to seduce the queen. The fact that he was the keeper of the king's intimate secrets turned against him. The accusers claimed that he used this knowledge to manipulate the monarch and his wife. Henry, whose ego was wounded, or who simply coldly calculated his moves, offered Norris a pardon in exchange for a confession of guilt. But Norris, being an aristocrat to the core, refused to implicate the queen and himself, choosing honor over life. His execution on the scaffold was a shock to the entire court. It showed that an intimate connection with power does not protect, but makes one a target. The position of groom of the stool did not lose its appeal after this, but those who held it became much more cautious. They realized that the stool was not just a miniature throne, but also a slow-acting electric chair. With the arrival of the Stuart dynasty, the nature of the position began to transform. James I, coming from Scotland, brought his favorites with him, which caused conflict with the English nobility. The groom of the stool became a figure of political discord. English lords demanded that only Englishmen hold this position, understanding that control over the king's body meant control over the country's resources. During this period, we see how the physiological aspect began to recede into the background, giving way to purely political functionality. Kings increasingly needed less literal assistance, but the ritual persisted as a symbol of access. The groom still offered the towel, but now it was more of a symbolic gesture, opening doors for discussions about episcopal appointments or the allocation of trade monopolies. However, during the Civil War and subsequent restoration, the question of access to the king's body again became critical. When Charles II returned to the throne, his bedroom became a thoroughfare for courtesans and schemers, and the groom of the stool had to possess the talent of an impresario to manage this chaos. The culmination of the evolution and subsequent decline of this position came in an era when the very concept of royal power began to change under the pressure of parliamentarism and enlightenment. In the 18th century, with the advent of the Hanoverian dynasty, kings increasingly became constitutional figures. George III, suffering from porphyria, a disease accompanied by bouts of madness, transformed the role of his grooms into that of orderlies in a psychiatric hospital. Here, there was no longer room for intrigue and grandeur. Only bare, unsightly physiology and human suffering remained. The grooms of that time were no longer proud favorites, but tired nurses, forced to conceal the monarch's madness from society to prevent the prestige of the crown from falling. During this period, intimacy became a burden, not a privilege. Keeping the secret that the king spoke to trees or did not control his natural urges was a difficult state task. The mystical aura around the royal body began to dissipate, giving way to medical diagnoses. The final blow to the position was dealt by Queen Victoria. For the first time in a long while, a woman was on the throne, and the presence of a male groom in her private chambers became impossible for reasons of propriety. Although the position was not formally abolished instantly, it transformed. Men were replaced by women, the ladies of the bedchamber, but the political weight of this role was lost. Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, began to reform the court, striving for efficiency and moral purity. The old medieval titles seemed to him a relic of a barbaric past. The position was renamed __1_, where _2_ was interpreted as a cape, a mantle, attempting to erase the association with a toilet stool. And its functions were reduced to the ceremonial dressing of the monarch. The dirty, physiological, animalistic part of power was pushed into the realm of invisible service, performed by ordinary servants without political weight. The era when the toilet was the center of the political universe was coming to an end. In 1901, when Edward VII ascended the throne, the position was finally abolished. The new century brought with it plumbing, sewerage, and new standards of privacy. The king could no longer afford to be, quote, "3" in his intimacy. Power became bureaucratic, administrative, distant from the body. The abolition of the groom of the stool position became a symbolic act of farewell to an era when the monarch's personality and the state were inseparable even at a biological level. This was the end of the magical realism of monarchy. Now decisions were made not to the rustle of velvet and the splash of water, but to the scratching of pens and the clatter of typewriters in dull ministerial offices. Nevertheless, the resonance of this story is still felt today, if one looks closer. Has the essence of the phenomenon disappeared when the form has changed? Look at modern leaders and their close circle. Every president, prime minister, or oligarch has their own bodyguard, their personal assistant, a person who carries their briefcase, hands them the phone, sees them tired, sick, off camera. These people, whose names we often don't even know, possess immense influence precisely because of the access factor. An assistant who decides whose call to connect to the president at 3 in the morning essentially performs the function of that very groom of the stool. Proximity to the leader's body is still currency. We can call it chief of staff or personal secretary, but the mechanism remains the same. Whoever controls the ruler's daily life influences their decisions. The lessons of the past tell us that informal power is often stronger than formal power. Institutions may be democratic, but human nature is hierarchical. He who is in the leader's comfort zone, who sees him without a tie, will always have an advantage over him who only sees him from a podium. Moreover, the story of the groom of the stool teaches us that power always has a physical dimension. We tend to forget that those who shape the fate of the world are biological organisms, subject to pain, aging, and simple needs. Decisions about war and peace can depend on how the president slept, what he ate for breakfast, and whether his digestion is bothering him. The groom of the stool was a reminder of this fragile humanity of power. By removing this position, we made power sterile in our imagination, but not in reality. We created the illusion that the state is governed by pure ideas and laws, while in reality, it is still governed by flesh and blood people. And perhaps what we lack is precisely such an honest view of things, an understanding that greatness and baseness always go hand in hand, that in a golden palace there is always a dark corner with a chamber pot, and that ignoring this fact means not understanding the very essence of human nature. Mentally returning to that dark royal bedchamber, we see the groom of the stool closing the lid of the velvet box, offering the king a bowl of fragrant water and a towel. The ritual is complete. The king rises, fastens his doublet, and once again transforms into an unattainable symbol of power. The groom steps back, dissolving into the shadows. In his pocket is the key to the room. In his memory is a secret that could cost someone their head, and in his plans is the appointment of a new minister. He smiles with the corners of his lips. The world outside sees the crown, scepter, and orb, but he knows the truth. True power smells not of incense, but of something much more earthly and real. And as long as people remain people, this law of proximity will work flawlessly, no matter what clothes new times dress it in.